Hale, thanks so much for joining me on an N of One. That's going to be so much fun. I got to see you in person recently, which is like a rare treat. Uh,
Those nachos were amazing. I'm still thinking about them, in fact.
yes, that was Lucha Libre Nacho Bar in
Yeah.
Chicago. Where we were all there for a conference was lovely. I'm so excited you're going to join me on an N of One. I know you've seen the show, right? The whole idea here is that we study populations, right? That's how we draw the scientific inference that we do, but that the stories of individual people actually matter, like the individual N of one study of somebody's life, particularly in a nascent field like applied behavioral science, where, every pathway is different and brings something unique to it. I think there's a lot of fun and a lot of opportunity. So that's what we're going to do with you. And I want to start by talking about little Hale, right? I want to go back to like 7-year-old, 6-year-old Hale. If I had found 6-year-old Hale, what would she have told me like she was going to be when she grew up? Like what was fascinating to you as a kid?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Okay, deep into the archives of Little Hale. I was kind of always been like a scientific problem-solving inquiry. As a kid, hobbies, things like that. I watched a lot of like PBS Nova episodes. Some favorites, a lot of David Attenborough, Planet, whatever that's called, the Blue Earth
Blue Earth.
situation, which was amazing. And yeah, just those days were fascinating. I had a book, one of my favorite books was about how crayons are made, right? Just what is that process? So just kind of a little science engineer. I loved math and finding patterns in things. So super, yeah, like super high on the nerd scale or from an early age. Mhm.
And what a wonderful scale it is. So if
Yeah.
I had asked Little Hale, it would have been something sort of sciencey. I'm going to grow up and,
Mhm. Mhm.
And did
Yeah.
that persist as you went like sort of into middle school and had more choice and
Mhm.
started to be able to
Mm.
kind of, when you're a kid, you don't get to pick your pathway as much, but as you get older,
Yeah.
you get a little more choice.
Right.
Did that persist?
Yeah. So it did, and it was actually, I was 10 when the idea of being an environmental psychologist kind of first occurred to me, although I called it a psycho-environmentalist, which it's really sad that that didn't catch on, but we kind of got there. But we had someone, I went to a delightfully liberal elementary school, and a former Shell oil executive came to talk to our class about peak oil. This was back in the 90s and climate change. This was the testimony on climate change had just happened, emerging concept. And he told us about all of these things in our class. Of course, we're fourth graders or whatever. And everyone is like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What are we going to do? And my immediate thought was not just what are we going to do, but how can we know about this and we're not already doing anything? And I had, I guess, discovered for myself that intention action gap. And I became fascinated by that from that point. And I wove and went in and out across my career. I, for a while, thought I wanted to be a neurologist and really study the human brain, and that didn't pursue. That did not work out for me. But but that was the nugget of that fascination with kind of the human mind and how our actions and how they're not always what we think they should be.
And so as you started to think about college, and I know yeah, U of O, right? Like
That's right.
back in my state of love.
Mhm.
Um, you did a BA in environmental psychology, which is
Mhm.
like such an unusual. I mean, you had a lot of clarity early on. Did you know that going in, or that sort of emerged while you were at U of O, or how did that come about?
Yeah, that emerged while I was at the U of O. So I was really originally thinking pre-med, and I actually didn't start at Oregon. I started at a university back east, and I did a year there, and I was just unhappy for a lot of reasons. I kind of couldn't find an advisor who I really wanted to work with. I was stuck in these, they're primary in those chemistry classes that you have to take in biochem is like to really try to get you to not want to do that anymore. And let me tell you, that worked really well. I did not want to do that anymore. And but the best thing about that was this freshman class that I had to take, which was about all about the physics and the society of oil in this country and alternative energy. And that was just a little bit of a random thing that I chose because it sounded interesting, but that set me back on the path from medicine and neurology, psychiatry to thinking about how can we apply these issues to the idea of us and our thinking to climate. And so then when I came back to Oregon, the year later I transferred back to the U of O, which was a wonderful fit for me. I loved it there. Was, and I knew that was kind of what I wanted to do. And I was randomly assigned to an advisor, Sarah Hodges, and I was talking to her about, here's what I think I want to do something in the environment. And she said, oh, well, good news. I have a grad student in my lab who's doing just that. And it was Ezra Markowitz. And I got to basically work with him in my undergrad. Ezra is in the environmental psychology world. There's kind of a running 6 degrees of Ezra separation joke because he has mentored a lot of people who I work with, but I have the honor of being the first while he was still in grad school. So that was, and then from there, I was very focused on the intersection of cognition. We didn't really call it behavioral science back then. That wasn't a thing that we referred to, but that kind of cognition and social psychology and how it gets applied to changing environmental behaviors.
And did you think that like the pathway was academic, meaning like I'm going to
Mhm.
do this and then I'm going to go get my PhD and then I'm
Mhm.
going to become a grad student like Ezra and then I'm going to go off and become a professor? Was like that the
Mhm.
notion, or was it a notion that like no, I'm going to work for like NORC or some, NGO or quasi-governmental something? Like where did you
Yeah.
think that was taking you?
Yeah. I really, if I should have kind of looked for more information about where exactly he was taking me at that point. I think the answer was kind of yes. I knew I wanted to go back to grad school. I always knew I wanted to do grad school in something. I just love school, I guess, in some ways, but I also was not strongly tied to being a professor. I don't think teaching, I was really focused on where we're going to have the most impact. I didn't think and I cared about the environment, but also recognized at the same time, right, like I'm not even a good recycler. I'm really not going to be on the advocacy side of this. How can I push things forward from the center? So that was really in undergrad when I was thinking about jobs. It was kind of how can I apply these skills to the environment, the things that I see failing in environmental advocacy right now and move that forward. But this was also the Great Recession, and I knew going out, I was like, the most important priority is to find a job, and added bonus if it ends up being a job that is related at all to my field. So,
Which it, kind of was,
mhm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
you did go
Oh
into
yeah.
something that like it wasn't totally
Mhm. Right.
random, right? Tell me a little
Yeah.
bit about like how did you end up at PCI and sort of what
Mhm.
sort of took you there?
Yeah, so it was so the PCI I was a temp job. I was actually processing rebates. It was like I literally came in and took pieces of paper, the rebate forms for, washing machine, right? $100 off and entered them into Salesforce. That was my I can add Salesforce to my resume now, but and I was such a good company and an idea that I liked, but it was just such boring work. I would actually download episodes of The West Wing onto those little, the first generation with the color screen iPods and listen to that while I worked. But it was a nice exposure into the market of where the money is in environment and in energy sustainability, right, and decarbonization, and understanding that market better and what are the opportunities. So, and that was wrapping up, and I was kind of up for a job with them. I at one point actually walked in, somehow got a meeting with a director or a VP there, and
Wait,
we yeah.
wait, wait.
Yes.
We have a rule on this podcast that we are not
Okay.
going to downplay our accomplishments here. I
Ooh.
somehow got a meeting. I so like you make it sound like it like fell out of the sky, right? You
Uh,
did something to get a meeting.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, so I kept asking people, so, I see we're trying to change behavior here. How are we going about it? What are what are people's motivations for this, right? Ultimately, we don't want people to get a rebate for something they were going to do anyway. We're trying to use the rebate as a mechanism to get people to do something else. So we thought about this from a psychological perspective. So I kept asking that question, and my boss was very helpful. I believe it was my boss who ultimately got me this meeting with the VP, and they're like, yes, little wee Hale, who was just wet behind the ears, just undergrad, and was like, yeah, that's happening at a director level right now. So, thanks for playing. I was like, okay, well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time. And then I went and so did not continue with PECI. Great organization. Was not a good fit for me. And then I just was looking for jobs that fit my skills, and this evaluation job popped up at Research and Action. And I didn't even, that was a energy efficiency program evaluation was not something that I knew existed before, but it was a
Yes.
natural,
But
right?
even if you didn't know it was existed, you closed your eyes and still hit the bullseye.
Yeah,
So,
no, it was great. And it was like, I just, one of those, you read the job application, you're like, ooh, that's me. That's me. Ooh, this looks good. And then I got to the hiring that they wanted more education than I had, but then I got to the hiring manager, and I knew the HR person at the company, it turned out randomly through somewhere else. I was like, okay, well, I'm probably not going to get this because they want someone with a master's, but I'm going to go after it anyway. And because I know this woman, and it just ended up being the perfect fit, because instead of being on program implementation, it was on program, which had been at ECI. It was on really program evaluation, which was just great for me. It was a small company, and I functionally got to just get all of this exposure doing mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative research to make programs better, which was exactly what I wanted to be doing. We call that behavioral science now. We did not at the time call it behavioral science, but
yes. I mean, this is the 2011, 2015 era. So the
yeah,
term is, in the ether somewhere, but not
right,
broadly applied,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Uh,
It was just starting then when I started there. Certainly in the environmental space anyway, in the energy space, that was just becoming a thing that you could actually have a behavior-based program. So,
yeah, I mean, things like O Power were
yeah,
sort of,
exactly.
like
Yep.
stuff was starting to cook a little bit. Were
Yeah.
there other people at uh, RIA that were as interested in you as this sort of like at this
Mhm.
intersection?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what made it a great place to work, is there's kind of everybody was. This is a lot of social science researchers who wanted to be impact focused. And a couple of the people that I worked with closely had, degrees in public policy or doctorates in cognitive psychology and linguistics. This was all people who wanted to link how people think and how we design these programs to change, to get people to buy a washing machine that is greener than otherwise. So it was a perfect place to learn that. And we got to work on one of the early papers there about how, like, the second wave of papers, is O Power was the first wave of behavior change in the energy space, and the second wave was, well, how can we go beyond O Power? So I got to spend some time thinking about, what does that look like, right? Well, we know what we've been doing now. How do we really change it, and not just change what we're doing, but change the perspective on it? Because it was a very engineering focused perspective, right? Of, we need to get a person to buy a thing. We will attribute some of that, and then we will save we'll take a proportion of those kilowatt hours, and we'll say that was the change, right? And it's a very kind of, yeah, just that classical economics perspective on what does it mean to change, so to have an impact, and kind of got to think about how to transition that.
And was school still in the back of your mind that like, hey, it's somewhere along the
Mm.
line here, I want to do more?
Yeah, it was. I really didn't necessarily apply a lot of rational thought to why. I knew that this was probably temporary, and I wanted to go back to grad school at some point. Yeah.
And did you have a concept of like that, as you pointed out when you were at RIA, there's a bunch of different potential, there's public policy, there's a bunch
Hmm.
of different sort of when did you decide that like
Mhm.
it's going to be a PhD in
Mm,
psychology, which is a very particular choice?
yeah. Yes, and I deliberately did not apply to grad school after undergrad because I just didn't feel like I knew which one of those avenues I wanted to go down. But it's funny because I think if I had applied to grad school right after undergrad, I would have ended up applying to exactly the same type of programs that I ended up going to, right? So really what I learned was my choice was the right one anyway, but it was a combination of the lens that I wanted to apply to it of that cognitive psychology lens and thinking through the heuristics and judgment and decision making framework and thinking about the people. And then also I honestly part of the reason I chose a PhD was also, I mean, a little bit financial because a psychology PhD, you have pretty decent funding. You're not taking on a lot of debt. You have potentially more flexibility there rather than a shorter program. You often end up with school debt at the end. And I knew that I like the idea of doing a dissertation and just having the freedom to really pick a topic and really have flexibility to be knowledgeable about it. So,
And what made you choose Columbia? Like as you were trying to make this choice, how did you sort of think about like what is the right way to compare these options?
yeah, I actually applied to grad school twice and I got into some programs after 3 years of working and then ended up moving to London instead of going to grad school for 2 years, which was fine. And I applied to similar programs both times. But there are a very small number of programs that are both psychology and environmental and have faculty, right, that are doing environmentally related psychology research. So that was a pretty narrow pool. And Columbia was at the top of my list because they had the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions, which is it's hard to get more perfectly aligned
Right
than
in
that.
the
Yeah,
zone for
exactly.
you.
Yep. Yeah, and I had read a lot of Elke Weber's papers, and I just really liked her philosophy and with the idea of because you can go somewhere else and be the only one who's off by yourself doing that, right? But it was the idea of having really a lab and a framework to be working on that together as a collaborative person that was very appealing to me.
Well,
So, and
and such a so often applied behavioral scientists are the lone, the lone
right,
applied behavioral, it is a
yeah,
very lonely life in a lot of organizations. And so I
yeah,
think there is something attractive for a lot of people, especially if you sort of recognize you might be spending a lot of time on your alone
right.
time in your
Mhm.
career on an island, you
Yeah,
know. Uh,
yeah. Which is funny because really I have spent a lot of time not being an N of one in orgs, really. So I am the other side of that coin. But yes, absolutely, it was nice to be in in a team there and be able to learn from multiple people. So
and do you think, I mean, to your point, you've chosen a set of places where there were other people around who looked and sounded sort of like you. Was that a really conscious part of how you chose places, or did that just sort of happen?
that's a good question. I think part of it just happened. I also tend to, and I think earlier in my career as well, but certainly that continues. Part of what I'm good at is being collaborative and helping people make their ideas better and refining that, right? There are some people who really want to be in a vacuum, heads down. I do my best work when I'm alone and then I present it, right? I am on the opposite side. If I really like to think out loud and make ideas better by bouncing them off with others, that doesn't have to be someone who does the same thing, right? Uh, that can be a kind of a collaborative cross-disciplinary relationship too, and it frequently is in when you're in the industry. But i I do think that's been part of certainly my early career was searching out those roles, but it was also just a function of there are only so many ways to be a researcher, right? Which I really would no longer describe myself as a researcher, but at the time I was doing a lot of research, and when you're doing research you tend to be surrounded by a couple of other people anyway who are doing research.
Yes, that's certainly true. Talk to me about, I mean, I think that's an interesting segue and distinction to make. When did you stop thinking of yourself as a researcher and start thinking of yourself more through the lens of
Mhm.
applied behavioral science?
Yeah, that was when I. It's a good question. It was, I am certainly grad school, always a researcher, and it was as I was thinking about it's fairly recently, I guess. Like long story short, pretty recently, that was really the transition for me of moving from Sea Change, which we're skipping ahead, but we'll circle back there too. But I think was getting to think about is I felt frustrated by the constraints of research because I that was the reason I left research and action. Ultimately, it's the time I really liked the work, but it just felt like you were downstream and you are doing something ultimately evaluation. When it's done right, you're really making a program better, and there's a feedback loop there, but frequently it's a one way, and the end of the process is a desk drawer into which your very nice report is put and never looked at again, right? And you're doing the same report for the same people, and you have these issues where people come to you and they don't ask the right question, and you try to build up that trust and say, hey, I know you asked me to do this, but what you really need is to start back here and look at this, because this we can do this. I'm happy to spend your money doing this, but it's not going to answer the question that you actually want to ask. And so that's, you just see these problems over and over again. You really get paid to do the same piece of research for multiple different people, and it just feels inefficient. And eventually my search for novelty, it just kind of felt like I wasn't having as much of an impact as I wanted to. So it was really that search for how can I better impact actual behavior that led me away from the research piece into how else can I have an impact there.
Let's, to your point, let's double back to Sea Change, right?
Mhm.
Because that is somewhat of the transition there, right? Is
Yep.
that, you know, you move from an evaluation organization to a much more action oriented.
Hmm.
Was there a culture shock to that, or was it because you kind of knew that that was what you wanted? It didn't feel as odd. Like, talk to me about that
Yeah.
transition.
Yeah. Like, as so, I mean, funny story. I was doing this utility consulting, right? Where utilities are just, there is so much red tape, so much vocabulary and kind of their own policy that you have to learn in order to be specific in there. And I left, so I left research and action in the utility world in July, started my doctorate in September, and then about a week later, one of my new colleagues got in touch with me and was like, "Hey, I work for this." She was a postdoc. She's like, "I work for this organization, the Sea Change Institute, and we need help speaking utility." Like, and Sea Change was doing a lot of similar consulting, and they had a great business model where really trying to connect academics to translate those insights to close the loop with utilities and other organizations, right? There's kind of what we know, and then there's what we're actually doing. But they really needed someone who spoke utility. And I spoke both academic and utility because they were giving them these big, long academic reports, and the utilities didn't know what to do with it. I'm like, nope. Like,
P less
so
than point oh
ironically,
0.05, don't
right.
you?
Right, exactly. So like ironically, I left because I was like, I don't want to do consulting anymore. I am done with this. I don't want to be a research consultant anymore. And then I ended up all through grad school and for the next 3 years after, literally just being a research consultant. And my boss and I, like Beth and I joke about that, right? Yeah, it's just like I ended up doing exactly what I said I was trying to get away from. And but I appreciated that we got more interesting work, and that was great and kept me busy for a long time. And also building up from doing the work to really managing and thinking about building those client relationships to do the work. So that was the transition that I finally got to the end of. Okay, I think I'm really ready to try something that is not primarily research consulting.
Well, and to your point, there's a difference between being on the fulfillment end of consulting and being on the consultative
Yes.
sales, like
Right.
earlier
Hmm.
pipeline end of
Yeah,
that. So as you became like an
absolutely.
MD and
Right.
carried revenue responsibilities and those sorts of things, like you
Yeah.
start to have a little more exposure to the
Right.
like,
Hmm.
whereas when you're more junior, right, it's an RA or somebody, right? Like even if you're
Right.
presenting to clients, it's still, to your
Yeah.
point,
Yes.
we have a format where we
Yep.
do the
Right.
thing and it's the thing
Hmm.
that we do
Yes.
all the time
Yeah.
for a slightly different company.
Right. And so much of the things in the energy industry are awarded by competitive RFP. So it is all fully baked by the time, and there's a lot of regulations around how you have to do the research. So there is very little room for creativity there. And the things we got to do at Sea Change were often outside that pipeline. So they were a lot more creative and really got to build collaborative relationships with organizations to solve their problems collaboratively.
And what, I mean, in that you eventually left Sea Change and um, went to CEE, like what did you not love about that environment, right? Like
Mhm.
what, as you got more exposed to the business and became an MD, did that feel natural? Did it feel unnatural? What about it like felt not maybe perfectly fitted for you at that moment in your life? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was when I really fully understood that I really enjoy being in that management role. And I have always really I have worked for small business organizations for most of my career. So I like that flexibility, but it also just comes with a lot of uncertainty, right? That you were dealing with the resourcing when you're a small organization. That's even harder. And the buck stops with you and it all, right? And if you aren't able to resource things properly, that's just the level of stress there. I was getting tired of that. It was actually, we're during the pandemic years now. So I'm in my house, working 12 hours a day and it's impacting my health. But we were getting great work. But it was the stress of that and just wanting to try something new that was not consulting for a while. And just kind of that feeling of, there's always a deadline and there's no one to give the work to, right? So that's gonna be you making that deadline. So that grinds you down after a while.
100%. I mean, it is consulting, unlike a big company, which is very much like a machine, and there's
Mhm.
you have your part of the machine and someone else has their part of the machine, and those two gel and fit together.
Right.
Consulting has the like, well, if I just spend one more hour, then I'll get one more
Yeah.
increment. There's
Mhm.
like the sort of
Yeah.
like weird utilitarian, like I could always do a little more, as opposed to
Yeah.
like, hey, there's like not
Yeah.
much more to do
Mhm.
until the other parts of the machine catch up that
Right.
comes with a bigger
Yeah.
company.
When yeah, absolutely. I love the direction that Sea Change has gone since I left too, because they have really focused on being a collaborative of practitioners and have really deep relationships with their clients and have changed somewhat the types of work that they do and are really doing great and interesting things for sure. And I think that was, we were kind of playing around with the business model and how we did it. And I think that was an experiment. And yeah, so there are lots of different ways to go about that.
And you have, stayed in, as much as you're like, oh, consulting, like you have stayed sort of
Mhm.
in and around this space as you
Mhm.
went on. Talk to me about your time at CE.
Yeah, so CE was my reaction to consulting, and CE was very much they did not do research. We just consumed research. We're not primarily a researcher. We did like teeny tiny soup song of research, but the primarily really a nonprofit consortium of utilities and designed to address some of the it's really trying to give the overarching view in a way that does not require you to have like a master's in energy policy to understand why it is. But basically there are some market failures in the energy efficiency world that utilities are kind of a victim of. And as a result, the amount of collaboration and learning that they do from each other is suboptimal, and they end up reinventing the wheel a lot more than they need to state by state. So CEE was designed really to help utilities more effectively transform the energy efficiency market by working together to set those rules. And I was on the evaluation side of how can we change the way we evaluate programs to take away some of the roadblocks to innovation. And it was fascinating. I met a lot of people and I met a lot of people and I think ultimately yeah, I really enjoyed it. The people were great. Ultimately, for me, it just was not a fit with my need to move quickly. Because this was an organization that moved at the speed of trust and consensus. And I just wanted to go and do things. And I think that if evaluation particularly, it was going to be a very uphill road to try to change regulations state by state, because a lot of this was dictated by utility regulators, not at the whim of the organization. So it was a good transition for me and a good example of, you know what, this is great. I tried this and it's not a good fit for my skills. There are too many things that I want to be doing that I'm not able to fully do. So
Well, and to your point
I
earlier, it's sort of a response to the consultant stuff you'd been doing
Mhm.
and potentially an overcorrection, right? So
Yeah.
you went
Mhm.
from consulting, I can put in unlimited energy and get out unlimited
Right.
opportunity, right? And in the course, burn myself out,
Yes.
to nope, here is the slowest, longest,
Yeah. Right.
most uphill,
Oh yeah.
most constrained sort of thing that
hmm
I can be doing.
Yes. Right. And it's one of those things you don't know until you try it. And I'm really glad that I tried it. The work-life balance was great, and I just turns out I need more stress and uncertainty in my life. So yeah.
You're like, more chaos, please. Now, by this point, are you thinking like if you introduced yourself at a cocktail party, how are you describing your career at this point, right? As you're
Mhm.
like at CEE, because you've now been doing energy for 15 years, right? You've been in this very
Mhm.
particular space in this very particular way. Are you calling yourself an applied behavioral scientist? How are you describing the work that you do to people who don't understand that work?
Yeah, I really have called myself an applied behavioral scientist mostly throughout grad school. It was really a behavioral scientist. And the way I talk about my work is about I live in the space between our long-term goals and our short-term behaviors. And how do we help ourselves align those together? And how do we help companies make it easier for all of us to do what we do, whether that is in health or in the environment or finances or elsewhere?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're presaging Limetree because
Mhm.
after CEE you
Yeah.
do take kind of
hmm
a hard right turn there.
Yes.
Talk to me about that decision making. Like,
hmm
how did you finally decide that, like, hey, a different industry focus is going to be something
hmm
that's important for me?
Yeah. So a couple of things. When I was trying to assess where I spent a lot of time soul searching during this process of really where can I have the most impact in this industry? I really want this industry to use behavioral science more effectively to facilitate behavior change on a large scale, right? On a big population scale. And the way the regulations work. And I had kind of nailed into actually maybe one of the pieces of those is actually the way it's communicated to people. Because I think there is a lot of communication that is very technical in the utility space. I don't know if you've ever looked into getting a rebate for a heat pump or a water heater. And
So this is not an interview
yeah,
about me, my friend Hale, but interestingly, so I grew up in rural Oregon where we had a co-op
yeah,
electricity, right? Flash Lane, and one of my first jobs was as the webmaster for the co-op because they wanted to
oh,
have a
that's
website,
fantastic.
and I
Okay.
was like, this 14-year-old kid who could like build websites, and so it was by modern standards, the ugliest thing you've ever seen. It's got a background that blinks and that kind of stuff. Uh,
Uh,
but it meant I got to sit in a whole bunch of
yeah,
meetings,
right.
to sort of get information from them, and got to kind of listen to the au revoir of what it means to
Yeah,
be. And of course, co-op electricity is its own special blend. Co-op utilities are their own special blend of complicated and interesting and weird and
right.
exactly the right kind of thing for
Mhm.
rural Oregon. Uh,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Oh, that's so funny. Well, so yeah, you have seen firsthand a lot of that language and how it is, bless them, it is written by engineers. And it is, if you go to your utilities website on adopting heat pump, there's all this federal funding that still exists on getting a heat pump. And state funding and utility funding, it is so difficult to understand what you're supposed to do. If you have somebody come in and give you a bid for a heat pump, it is overwhelming. So I was kind of getting to the point, well, or maybe we don't need to design the programs differently. Maybe we really need to communicate about them differently. So that was leading me in the marketing direction. I also really liked the idea of marketing because you get to have full control of how your research is used because your research is designed to improve the marketing. So you do a thing and then you execute the thing. And I was really drawn to that. And I just looking at the energy industry, I didn't see a place where I didn't want to start my own shop and I didn't see a place where I would have a home there to really scale that up. And so I started thinking, well, maybe I need to do multiple industries. And so I found Limetree was a company that I'd worked for a little bit in the past as well. I had a good, my original colleague who introduced me to Sea Change in the first place has also done some work for Limetree, and Lisa Zuval, and she introduced me to Limetree as well. So, again, it's all a network thing. And it just, I really liked the way they were using behavioral science, not just as a stamp to be innovative, but really deeply living behavioral science and the opportunities there. So ended up taking the plunge.
And talk to me about like deciding to take this plunge outside of energy and into
Mhm.
health, right? Which, your cocktail pitch included the most recent, and
Mhm.
maybe it's health, uh,
Yeah.
right? But
Mhm.
at the time, as you're making this transition, almost a year and a half ago now,
Mhm.
right? What, like, how did you sort of reconcile that for yourself?
Yeah. I was still feeling really burnt out about energy in general. And that was one of the things from CEE that even made me more pessimistic about whether the things that I felt were broken in the industry were going to change. And I felt like I needed a break from banging my head against the wall there. And I have done some non-energy work over the years here and there. I've done some healthcare work in the past, which I found really interesting. But that was honestly, so, and I still, one of the things that we will likely do at Limetree is at some point is get back into the energy space, because that's still a place where I have a lot of connections, a lot of friends, and would love to. As it happens, it's not a great time to be in the energy space right now, unfortunately. So it ended up being good timing for me. But I will say healthcare has in some ways been a breath of fresh air. There is so much, and there is just, it's such a bigger industry. The energy efficiency industry is about $10 billion in North America. That is so small. The healthcare industry is, what, $1 in 5 of the US economy goes toward healthcare. And there's also a lot more competition. So there's a lot more space and appetite for innovation. And I know a lot of people say the healthcare industry is very risk averse, but that is nothing on the energy industry. So it was all of a sudden you have people who are willing to do A/B tests. They're eager to do A/B tests in the field. And it was like pulling teeth in the energy industry to be like, hey, maybe we could test this. And like, well, why don't you just tell me what works the best and then we'll do that
We'll
one.
do
And
that
that,
because you
yeah, right.
said
And
so.
that's great. And there was a fear which justified, right, justified the way the utility structure is worked. They're heavily, highly regulated, and the perception was that that kind of testing, right, would be manipulative, and that it's also just difficult to do with the way things were set up. So it was just, but long as there's a breath of fresh air in the healthcare industry to be able to really have more space to innovate and have more deeper pockets to think about ways to do so and more different problems to solve. So just on a bigger scale, but I miss energy. I will be back. It is not goodbye. It is just, and I've been active, continue to be active in the energy space in various volunteer capacities, just not currently in my professional
Well, let's talk about
book
that
of
for a second
business.
because you have had an interesting volunteer sort of thread as well, right? You've been involved with the APA and
Mhm.
talk to me about sort of where that how did you end up deciding that you want to sort of work on some of those adjacent spaces? Where did that come up for you? Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have been, that's one thing you get into as a grad student too, and other, right? All of these organizations and conferences, it's a very academic thing to do. And the energy industry as well has a lot of conferences and organizations just to facilitate networking. And so I had presented and been at the APA, like the American Psychological Association, APA, and they're structured into divisions. One of the divisions is Division 34, the Society for Environmental Population and Conservation Psychology, SEPSIP, one of my least favorite acronyms, but I was not successful in changing it. We'll say that. But it is, and so they approached me just right as I was right as I was in a career transition, and asked if I would do a 3-year tour of service as their president, and that was it just came in at a great time for me when I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to stay in the industry, but I really recognized how important it was and wanted was it just another avenue into that. How do we think differently? How do we get more people working on the issue of translating research? So it was a really it was also just a great personal growth experience for me to kind of lead a small nonprofit basically for a couple of years and understand how, get everything going on that and lead executive committee meetings and get to work with and network with fun people. We put on a conference. It was yeah, so it was a great and interesting experience and got to meet a lot of grad students interested in getting into the space and other career professionals. It can be a lonely profession, right? To your point, an N of one, right? It's often very lonely for everybody, and this was another space for people to get together on that, mostly on the academic side, to be have community.
And do you miss the academic community? Like, or is there a part of you that, I know teaching wasn't necessarily something
Mhm.
that called out for you. Is there a part of you that like misses the academic life?
Mhm. I would say no. They're like easy answer. Yeah, no. I love the academic people, but academic work for me was and that's I want to live more in the applied space of solving problems and the academic pieces of the academic community do that, but I think particularly in psychology, the emphasis is really on contributing to theory. And that was not a good fit for me. So a lot of the professors who have been most successful in environmental psychology these days are not in no longer in psychology departments because it's very difficult to make that work there. They're in public policy schools, they're in even marketing departments and environmental studies departments as the psychology. So, but my experience with psychology, I don't know, Walter Walter Michel, who was at Columbia while I was there, one of his quotes is theories are like toothbrushes. Everyone has one and nobody wants to use anybody
Everybody else
else's.
is, yeah.
Yeah. And it's, that illustrates that the field is just very scattered and there's a lot of things that have different names but are very similar concepts. And I love that. And instead of doing that piece, I want to be over here like wrapping them all up together and figuring out how we put them into play in the field.
Yeah, I can. So it's an ironic quote from Walter Michel, also maker of his own frameworks, uh,
Yes.
maker and defender of his own
Oh
frameworks,
yeah.
right? Which is
Mhm.
unfortunately how the academic game has to play out. I
Yeah.
think it was well said when you said, I love the academic people, but don't want to deal with the academic system,
Yeah.
uh, which has different success criteria
Right.
um, than the systems that you have now chosen to engage in. Can you see yourself going? You've led this largely consultant life a lot of the time.
Mhm.
Do you see yourself going in-house at some point?
I thought about it. I looked into it. You and I actually talked about that. I came to you and was like, "Hey, tell me more about what that would be like." And I wouldn't rule it out, but I really like working at a small organization. I really enjoy having that management piece, right? Of you're both doing the behavioral science work, but you're really helping the train stay on the tracks and in an operations role as well. And how do we get all of that done? How do we grow the business and being strategic there beyond the behavioral science as well? So it's possible, but it wouldn't, I'm pretty happy where I am right now. I really like the small business role and kind of having my own empire and very few levels above me to tell me what to do.
Um,
But
but
never say never.
For sure, but we talked a little bit about how, at Sea Change and things that could be a little bit of a burnout. How have you figured
Mhm.
out how to balance that a little more as, in
Yeah.
that consulting environment where you could do one more
Mhm.
thing, you could always do one more thing and one more thing and one more thing.
Yeah.
How have you figured out how to sort of guardrail that for yourself?
Mhm. I'll get back to you when I figure it out, really. But no, Part of this for me was recognizing that I actually need a little bit of that to feel fulfilled, because I think when I didn't have it, I just am prone to overthinking and making more work for myself. So for me, it's about finding the right level of stress that is motivating but not overwhelming. There's probably somebody could tell me a better way to do that, but it's working for me, so I'm going to stick with it. But certainly that has been, I've had a lot of control over how I structure my piece of the world here and how I hire. And there will always be some of that, but figuring out where the resources are and changing the way that works a little bit has been helpful. And yeah, just having a slightly bigger bench in terms of more resources to take over some of the work. But it is very much still there. It I mean, I will say too that the marketing, some of it has a different cadence of the work because it's really an ongoing, right? And the deadlines are more known. So that's helpful too, because it's a balance of fires that you're putting out and things with urgent deadlines, right? And then also kind of the business, there is that proportion of the portfolio that is really the business as usual scenario, which is helpful. Yeah. So you can kind of pull on, you have more levers to pull on.
Yeah, some of the less project-based and more systemic
Hmm.
sort of
Yep.
evergreen, ongoing relationship
Right.
stuff
Yeah.
can be very stabilizing, um, for sure. Uh, what do you think about, as you continue to grow the business and you
Mhm.
continue to grow Limetree, like, and this is the first time, you've had that, you got the director of behavioral science title, right? It's in the name, right? Even if you
Right.
described yourself as a behavioral scientist in an ongoing way, this is sort of the first time that it's like a big in the name
Mhm.
thing. Has that made a
Yeah.
difference for you? Do you find yourself evangelizing behavioral scientists in a different way now that,
Mhm.
it's in how you self-present?
Mhm. That's a good question. In general, I would say not really, but I think very much, but that's just mostly a function of while behavioral science wasn't in my title at Sea Change, it was very much in our mission as an organization. So if any, it has changed how I talk about it because the audience of people who I talk about behavioral science is less familiar with behavioral science. So I think that has been part of the really interesting challenge is just working with a wider group of people who have less familiarity, right? They're not necessarily looking for research, they're looking to solve a problem. And we get to figure out, is that going to be market research? Is that going to be just going straight to market with something? And so it's a broader kind of meeting people where they're at and figuring out how to translate that. But it is moving away from it's using the process but really focusing on the outcome in a different way. And I think that's a challenge of behavioral science because behavioral science really by definition is a process, right? And that's a good sell for some companies, and that's also not, it takes some vision to see what that means and how that's going to impact you, because you can also pitch that in a way that seems expensive and esoteric and not impactful, right? And I've certainly managed to do that a couple of times, but I'm getting better.
Well, and you have, I mean, in part because of your interesting career, movements, you've had this opportunity to sort of have a lot of practice at explaining the outcome portion
Mhm.
of behavioral
Yeah.
science. To your point, which is very process oriented, and frankly, nobody buys processes, right? People buy
Right.
outcomes.
Right. Yeah.
Particularly in the marketing space, particularly in the healthcare marketing space that you're
Right.
working in now, right? Like it's extraordinarily outcome
Yes.
driven.
Absolutely.
Because to your
Yeah.
point, I mean, I think you made a nice point earlier about the sort of size of the market. There is a if we take Matt's like behavioral science as the genie to other people's Aladdin, if I rub my fuzzy bald head and snap my fingers and everybody and 10% more people buy a heat pump, it it's good for the environment, but it isn't abundantly clear that
Right.
anybody's like jumping for
Right.
joy, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, if I rub my fuzzy bald head and 10% of traditional Medicare people convert to Medicare Advantage,
Right.
somebody's having a real good day, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, well, absolutely. And just the scale of success for buying a heat pump for a particular utility might be measured in hundreds, right? Whereas we're really, yeah, we're talking about just a completely different magnitude of impact. Yes, for sure. So We have it's been really fun. We have actually, since I joined, expanded our services a lot in terms of the types of problems that we're offering. We've really done more strategy and behavioral science consulting and guiding how those communications and products get into process. So we're a behavioral science marketing firm, but we also I tag on consulting at the end because we do that, and we have gotten, yeah, we have increased we've grown a lot this year. There's a pretty high percentage increase, which is really just exciting to see the kinds of things that are going on and the traction that we're getting in the market, because it is hitting a nerve with people, and in a fun way for sure.
Do you feel like people are getting more familiar, or do you feel like you're still having that same break the ice, let me explain it to you conversation as often?
Yeah, people are definitely getting more familiar. And I think when we think about 5 years ago, even, that was very much a foreign term to a lot of people interested in research, but not the idea of behavioral science. And thanks to, I think, in the healthcare space, a lot of big messaging platforms that have really very publicly and centrally incorporated behavioral science, thanks to some other theories, a lot of popular literature now that people have written and consumed, right, on behavioral science. So it is yes, the getting over the hump of what do I know, what do I do with it, and then also that then there's the next phase to being a behavioral scientist who has read a book versus, right, how do you get more out of it? Because we also we had the behavioral science backlash of the limitations of nudge and how we need to go beyond that, right? And if we are dealing with it, what needed impact of 10%, behavioral science can deliver 0.5%, we're not hitting the mark. So really taking that broader lens and helping people understand. But it is almost now becoming a buzzword that people have heard of, but some people get it, and some people, it even makes them a little more skeptical of what that is. So it's an exciting, yeah, exciting to be in a relatively new field in a lot of ways, but it's also you don't necessarily fit anywhere, right? People have to make a new category for you. You don't quite fit in the existing mental models.
Yeah, I can definitely hear. And what a great place to end it. I mean, I think there's a line you got to walk there, right? Because if it comes too buzzy, like we want people to invest in it, and we want it to be a thing that people are interested in, but interested in a
Right.
way that is genuine and unique and thoughtful, and not just like, well, I'll rub some behavioral science on it, which, unfortunately, so many people do get hired to sort of zhoosh
Hmm.
things up with academic sounding
Right.
theory without really changing the outcome of what we're doing. And the whole point of science is that, we do want to change the
Yeah.
outcome. We do want to do the thing that works. We do want to there's
Yeah.
no meaningful change. Why do we do this process? Um,
Absolutely.
what a wonderful place to end it. And thank you so much for coming on and like sharing your story, Hale. I think, you've had such a particularly interesting, you do this enough, and there are themes that you hear, right? There's sort of an entrepreneurial theme that, most applied behavioral scientists have at least some sort of, there's a little bit
Yeah.
of drive and animus about, hey, I want to understand things and I want to grow. And there's a reason we don't end up in academia, right? Uh, 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 but there's also so much unique about your story. You just don't see that many people who have been able to thread so many needles successfully in terms of being able to pivot sort of industries and pivot sort of functions and pivot throughout their career. And I'm so glad I get to hang out with you and that we get to be friends. And you're such a credit to Oregonians. Yeah, like
That's right.
you gotta
Oregonians.
you
Yeah.
gotta I gotta hold down the Oregonian behavioral science
Uh,
flag. Uh,
yeah, talk about, I guess well, it's not an N of two. I know others, but it's a small sample size for sure. So, well, thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure. I can't remember the last time that I talked about myself for an hour, so that was uncomfortable, but we got through it.
oh, you did great, and it's going to inspire somebody else along their pathway and make their
Yeah.
pathway just a little bit easier. And
Absolutely. That
you know,
has certainly been one of my goals, is to help other people find their way in this industry. And I spend a lot of time talking with people who are trying to figure out what that looks like, and always happy to share my unique story if that is helpful to someone else. So, yeah, I appreciate you doing this.
And I think it has been. I mean, I think you're such a good citizen in the sort of big C version of that word of the behavioral science community, right? I mean, I think it unfortunately, some of the words that we talked about, like consultant, can cause people to maybe not invest in the community
Yeah.
and grow potential competitors and all of the things that people can potentially be competitive about. And you've done a wonderful job of really building your own career as an executive, as a behavioral scientist, as a woman, as a researcher, sort of pushing ahead this field without necessarily needing to make it into something that was competitive, which is sort of the dark side of that version of
Yeah.
things. Um, More nachos to follow, I
Thank
think
you.
is the
That's
answer.
right. That's right. There better be nachos involved next time I see you, but then just show up in San Diego with some nachos.
I
Let's hang
mean,
out.
we are the right place. Anytime Oregon gets, right around February when you
Yeah.
haven't seen the
Mhm.
sun in 4 months, you come on down. It'll still be 70 and sunny here. So you just come
Yeah,
right on by. Hale,
for
always a
sure.
pleasure. I'll see you on down the road.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Matt.